award-winning teacher humiliated and unjustly fired. 30 years later, he returns and his revenge is epic. Hello, welcome, leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. In a small Midwest town, a brilliant educator's career is shattered by a shocking betrayal. Decades later, he resurfaces with an audacious plan to revolutionize the very institution that cast him aside. As the community buzzes with speculation, no one could predict the extraordinary chain of events his return would set in motion, or the profound impact it would have on countless lives. The harsh fluorescent lights of Jefferson High's main office did little to soften the blow as Principal Robert Hawkins delivered the news that would shatter Dr. Ethan Foster's world. "I'm sorry, Ethan, but the board has decided to terminate your employment, effective immediately." Ethan, a man in his early 40s with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, felt as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. His mind raced, trying to process the words he'd just heard. "But why? My students' test scores are the highest in the district. I just won the State Teacher of the Year award. This doesn't make any sense." Principal Hawkins, a portly man with thinning hair and a permanent sheen of sweat on his forehead, couldn't quite meet Ethan's gaze. "There have been complaints, accusations of impropriety with a student." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He staggered back, gripping the edge of a nearby chair to steady himself. "That's impossible," he whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "I would never." "I know, Ethan," Hawkins cut in, his tone a mixture of pity and resignation. "But in situations like this, the board feels it's best to err on the side of caution. You understand, don't you?" But Ethan didn't understand. How could he? In the span of a few minutes, his entire life, a life dedicated to education, to nurturing young minds and inspiring a love of learning, had been upended. He thought of his students, of the robotics club he'd founded, of the upcoming science fair he'd spent months preparing for. All of it gone in an instant. As if reading his thoughts, Hawkins added, "You'll need to clear out your classroom by the end of the day. We'll have a substitute take over your classes for the remainder of the year." Ethan nodded numbly, his mind still reeling. He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Who?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who made the accusation?" Hawkins hesitated, then sighed. "I'm not at liberty to say, Ethan. I'm sorry." The walk to his classroom felt like a march to the gallows. Students in the hallway called out cheerful greetings, oblivious to the devastation that had just occurred. Ethan managed weak smiles in return, his heart breaking with each step. As he began to pack up his belongings, his hands shaking as he placed books and personal items into cardboard boxes, a knock at the door startled him. He looked up to see Amanda Chun, one of his brightest students, standing in the doorway. "Dr. Foster?" she asked, her brow furrowed with concern. "What's going on? Why are you packing up your stuff?" Ethan swallowed hard, fighting back the lump in his throat. I'm leaving, Amanda. Today's my last day." Amanda's eyes widened in shock. "What? But you can't leave. What about the robotics competition? And the science fair? You're the best teacher we've ever had." Her words, meant as a compliment, only twisted the knife deeper. Ethan managed a sad smile. "Sometimes, life takes unexpected turns. I'm sure whoever takes over will do a great job." But Amanda wasn't satisfied. "This isn't fair," she protested, her voice rising. "We need you here, Dr. Foster. You're the only one who believes in us, who pushes us to be better." Ethan felt his resolve crumbling. He wanted to tell her everything, to rail against the injustice of it all. But he knew he couldn't burden her with the ugly truth. Instead, he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Amanda, listen to me. You are brilliant, capable, and destined for great things. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Promise me you'll keep pushing yourself, keep asking questions, keep challenging the world around you." Tears welled up in Amanda's eyes as she nodded. "I promise," she whispered. As Amanda left, Ethan turned back to his packing, his movements mechanical. He carefully wrapped the Teacher of the Year plaque he'd received just months ago, the irony of it now a bitter taste in his mouth. Photos of past science fairs, debate team victories, and candid moments with students went into the box next, each one a reminder of the life he was being forced to leave behind. By the time the final bell rang, Ethan's classroom, once a vibrant hub of learning and discovery, was bare. The posters showcasing great scientists and inspirational quotes were gone, leaving behind only faded rectangles on the walls. His desk, normally cluttered with graded papers and half-finished lesson plans, was empty. As he carried the last box to his car, Ethan paused to look back at Jefferson High. For 15 years, this building had been his second home. He'd poured his heart and soul into these halls, believing that education was the key to a better future. Now, he felt like an outsider cast out based on a lie. Driving away from the school for the last time, Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger at the injustice of it all, sadness for the students he was leaving behind, fear for what the future might hold. But beneath it all, buried deep, was a tiny spark of determination. He didn't know how or when, but someday he would clear his name. Someday he would return and set things right. Little did Ethan know that someday would be 30 years in the making, and his return would shake Jefferson High and the entire town to its very foundations. 30 years passed like a blur for Ethan Foster. The sting of his unjust dismissal never truly faded, but it became a dull ache rather than the searing pain it had once been. In the decades that followed that fateful day, Ethan had reinvented himself, driven by a mixture of necessity and a burning desire to prove his worth. He'd left town almost immediately, unable to bear the whispers and sidelong glances from people who had once been his friends and colleagues. With his reputation in tatters, finding another teaching job had been impossible. Instead, Ethan had thrown himself into the tech industry, leveraging his scientific knowledge and passion for innovation into a successful career. Now, at 72, Dr. Ethan Foster was a different man in many ways. His once dark hair was now completely silver, and lines of experience etched his face. But his eyes still held that same spark of curiosity and determination that had made him such an effective teacher all those years ago. As Ethan stood at the podium of a packed auditorium in Silicon Valley, accepting yet another award for his groundbreaking work in educational technology, his mind drifted back to Jefferson High. He thought of Amanda Chan and wondered what had become of her and his other students. Had they achieved their potential? Had anyone been there to nurture their talents and push them to excel? And so, it is with great pleasure that I announce the launch of the Foster Foundation for Educational Excellence. Ethan concluded his speech, his voice strong and clear. This nonprofit organization will work to bring cutting-edge technology and innovative teaching methods to underfunded schools across the country. The applause was thunderous, but Ethan barely heard it. His mind was already racing ahead, formulating the plan he'd been quietly working on for years. It was time to go home, time to face the past and, hopefully, reshape the future. 2 weeks later, Ethan found himself driving down the familiar streets of his hometown. Much had changed in 30 years, but there was still a sense of recognition, of belonging, that both comforted and unsettled him. As he pulled up in front of Jefferson High, Ethan's heart raced. The building looked older, a fresh coat of paint unable to hide the wear of decades. But it was still unmistakably the place where his life had taken such a dramatic turn. Taking a deep breath, Ethan stepped out of his car and made his way to the main office. The hallways were quieter now, summer vacation having emptied the school of its usual bustle. As he approached the front desk, a young receptionist looked up, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of this distinguished-looking stranger. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked politely. Ethan smiled, trying to project a confidence he didn't entirely feel. "Yes, I have an appointment with Principal Thompson, Dr. Ethan Foster." The receptionist's eyes widened even further. "Oh, of course, Dr. Foster. Principal Thompson is expecting you. Please go right in." As Ethan entered the office, the very same office where his career had been shattered 3 decades earlier, he was greeted by a woman in her early 50s with a warm smile and sharp, intelligent eyes. Dr. Foster, Principal Sarah Thompson said, extending her hand. It's an honor to meet you. Your work in educational technology is truly groundbreaking. Ethan shook her hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze. Thank you, Principal Thompson. I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me on such short notice. As they sat down, Ethan couldn't help but notice how different this encounter felt from his last meeting in this office. The tension in his shoulders began to ease slightly. So, Principal Thompson began, leaning forward with interest. To what do we owe the pleasure of your visit? When your foundation contacted us about a potential partnership, I must admit I was intrigued. Jefferson High isn't usually on the radar of major philanthropic organizations. Ethan took a deep breath. This was the moment he'd been preparing for, the first step in a plan years in the making. Principal Thompson, I have a proposal for you. One that could transform Jefferson High and potentially serve as a model for schools across the country. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But before we discuss that, there's something you should know. 30 years ago, I was a teacher here at Jefferson High, and I was unjustly fired based on false accusations. Principal Thompson's expression shifted from curiosity to shock. I had no idea. Dr. Foster, I'm so sorry. That must have been terrible for you. Ethan nodded, grateful for her empathy. It was, but I'm not here for sympathy or revenge. I'm here because, despite everything, I still believe in the power of education to change lives, and I want to give back to the community that shaped me, for better or worse. He leaned forward, his eyes alight with passion. What I'm proposing is a complete overhaul of Jefferson High's curriculum and facilities, state-of-the-art technology in every classroom, personalized learning programs for every student, teacher training in the latest pedagogical methods, a STEM-focused approach that prepares students for the jobs of tomorrow. Principal Thompson listened intently, her expression a mixture of excitement and disbelief. Dr. Foster, that sounds incredible, but forgive me for asking, how would we possibly fund something like that? Ethan smiled. That's where my foundation comes in. We're prepared to fully fund this initiative for the next 5 years, with the possibility of extension based on results. All we ask in return is your full cooperation and the freedom to implement our program without interference. The principal sat back in her chair, clearly overwhelmed. This is extraordinary, Dr. Foster. But I have to ask, why us? Why Jefferson High? Ethan's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of determination. Because this is where it all began for me, both the highs and the lows. And because I believe that by transforming this school, we can send a powerful message about the importance of second chances and the enduring value of education. He paused, then added softly, and perhaps in some small way, it might help set right an old wrong. Principal Thompson nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. Dr. Foster, I would be honored to partner with you and your foundation, but I think it's only fair to warn you, change isn't always easy, especially in a small town like ours. There may be resistance, both from within the school and the broader community. Ethan's eyes glinted with a mixture of determination and something that might have been mischief. Oh, I'm counting on it, Principal Thompson. In fact, I'm rather looking forward to it. As they shook hands to seal their agreement, neither of them could have predicted the waves of change and controversy that were about to sweep through Jefferson High and the entire town. Ethan Foster's return was just the beginning, and his revenge would indeed prove to be epic, though not in the way anyone might have expected. The news of Dr. Ethan Foster's return and his ambitious plans for Jefferson High spread through the small town like wildfire. Within days, it seemed everyone had an opinion on the matter, and those opinions were sharply divided. At the local diner, longtime residents gathered to discuss the latest developments over coffee and pie. I don't like it one bit, grumbled Harold Jennings, a retired factory worker. Who does this Foster fella think he is? Swooping in here with his big city ideas. Our school was good enough for my kids, and it's good enough for my grandkids. Across the table, Marge Holbrook, a former teacher herself, shook her head. But Harold, don't you see? This could be an incredible opportunity for our children. The world is changing, and our kids need every advantage they can get. As the debate raged on in diners, living rooms, and street corners across town, Ethan was hard at work laying the groundwork for his educational revolution. He'd set up a temporary office in a vacant storefront downtown, the windows plastered with colorful posters showcasing the latest in educational technology. One sunny afternoon, as Ethan was poring over blueprints for classroom renovations, the bell above the door chimed. He looked up to see a familiar face, Amanda Chen, now a woman in her late 40s, her dark hair streaked with gray but her eyes still sharp and curious. "Dr. Foster?" she said, her voice a mixture of disbelief and excitement. "I thought it might be you, but I could hardly believe it." Ethan's face broke into a wide smile as he stood to greet her. "Amanda, my goodness, look at you. All grown up and a doctor, I see," he added, noticing the medical scrubs she wore. Amanda nodded, grinning. "Pediatrician. And it's all thanks to you, Dr. Foster. You're the one who first got me interested in science, who made me believe I could do anything I set my mind to." As they caught up, Amanda's expression grew serious. "Dr. Foster, I never believed the accusations against you. None of us did, your students, I mean. We tried to protest, to tell the school board they were making a mistake. But no one would listen to us." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. After all these years, the pain was still there, but Amanda's words were a balm he hadn't realized he needed. "Thank you, Amanda. That means more to me than you know." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Principal Thompson, her arms laden with binders. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said, noticing Amanda. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "Not at all," Ethan replied. "Sarah, I'd like you to meet Dr. Amanda Chun. She was one of my students, a few years back," he added with a wink. "Amanda, this is Principal Sarah Thompson. She's been instrumental in getting this project off the ground." As the three of them discussed the plans for Jefferson High, Amanda's eyes lit up with excitement. "This is incredible," she said, leafing through one of the binders. "State-of-the-art labs, personalized learning programs. Dr. Foster, this is going to change so many lives." Ethan nodded, his expression a mixture of pride and determination. "That's the goal, Amanda. But we've got our work cut out for us. Change isn't always easy, especially in a town like this." As if on cue, a commotion outside drew their attention. A small group of protesters had gathered on the sidewalk, carrying handmade signs with slogans like, "Keep big tech out of our schools," and "Foster go home." Principal Thompson sighed. "And so it begins," she said, her tone resigned. "The school board meeting next week is going to be interesting, to say the least." Ethan's eyes narrowed as he watched the protesters through the window, but instead of anger or frustration, there was a glint of challenge in his gaze. "Well then," he said, turning back to Amanda and Sarah with a smile, "I suppose we'd better be prepared to make our case, hadn't we?" The following week, the school board meeting was standing room only. The tension in the air was palpable as Ethan took the podium to present his plan. He looked out over the sea of faces, some curious, some hostile, some hopeful, and took a deep breath. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady and clear, "I stand before you today not as an outsider looking to impose my will, but as a son of this town, a former teacher of this very school, who wants nothing more than to give back to the community that shaped me." As Ethan laid out his vision for Jefferson High, he could see the crowd's mood shifting. Even some of the most vocal opponents seemed to be listening intently, their expressions thoughtful. "I know change can be scary," Ethan continued, "but the world our children are growing up in is changing faster than ever before. We owe it to them to provide an education that prepares them for that world. An education that ignites their curiosity, nurtures their talents, and gives them the tools to succeed in ways we can barely imagine." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. 30 years ago, I stood in this very building and promised my students that I would always believe in them, always push them to be their best selves. Today, I'm here to renew that promise, not just to the students of Jefferson High, but to this entire community. As Ethan finished his speech, the room erupted in applause. It wasn't unanimous, but it was substantial. Principal Thompson, sitting in the front row, gave him a subtle thumbs up. But the night wasn't over yet. As the floor opened for questions and comments, Harold Jennings, the retired factory worker from the diner, stood up. "Now wait just a minute," he called out, his voice gruff. "This all sounds real nice, Mr. Foster, but let's not forget why you left this town in the first place. How do we know we can trust you with our kids?" A hush fell over the room. Ethan felt his heart racing, but he forced himself to remain calm. This was the moment he'd been both dreading and preparing for. "Mr. Jennings," Ethan said, his voice steady, "you're right to be cautious. The accusations made against me 30 years ago were serious. They were also completely false, a fact that I've spent 3 decades trying to prove." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "I have here signed affidavits from former students, colleagues, and community members attesting to my character and refuting the allegations. I also have the results of a private investigation that uncovered evidence suggesting the accusations were fabricated by someone with a personal vendetta against me." As Ethan handed the documents to the school board members, he continued, "I'm not here to rehash old wounds or seek vindication. I'm here because, despite everything that happened, I still believe in the power of education to transform lives. And I believe that Jefferson High and this community deserve the very best." The room was silent for a moment as people processed this information. Then, slowly, Amanda Chen stood up. "I was Dr. Foster's student," she said, her voice clear and confident. "He was the best teacher I ever had, and I wouldn't be where I am today without his guidance and support. If he says he's here to help, I believe him." One by one, other former students and colleagues stood up, each sharing their own stories of how Ethan had impacted their lives. The tide of opinion in the room was visibly turning. As the meeting drew to a close, the school board voted unanimously to approve Ethan's proposal. There was still work to be done, minds to be changed, and challenges to overcome. But as Ethan looked out over the crowd, at the mix of excitement, apprehension, and hope on their faces, he knew that his journey of redemption and transformation had truly begun. Little did anyone realize that this was just the first chapter in a story that would not only change Jefferson High, but would spark a nationwide conversation about the future of education, the power of second chances, and the true meaning of justice. The transformation of Jefferson High began in earnest as summer gave way to fall. The once quiet halls now buzzed with activity as construction crews worked tirelessly to upgrade classrooms, install new technology, and create state-of-the-art learning spaces. Ethan found himself at the center of a whirlwind of activity, overseeing every aspect of the renovation while also working closely with Principal Thompson and the teaching staff to develop new curricula and training programs. The days were long and the work was challenging, but Ethan felt more alive than he had in years. One crisp September morning, as Ethan was inspecting the newly installed computer lab, he bumped into a familiar face. Jack Holloway, now in his 60s, who had been a fellow teacher at Jefferson High all those years ago. Well, Jack said, his tone a mixture of surprise and wariness. "If it isn't the prodigal son himself." Ethan tensed slightly, unsure of Jack's intentions. "Hello, Jack. It's been a long time." Jack nodded, his eyes roaming over the gleaming new equipment. "That it has. I have to say, Ethan, when I first heard you were coming back, I didn't know what to think. Part of me wondered if you were here for some kind of payback." Ethan shook his head, a sad smile on his face. "No, Jack, I'm not here for revenge. I'm here to make a difference, to give these kids opportunities we could only dream of when we were teaching together." Jack was quiet for a moment, studying Ethan's face. Then, to Ethan's surprise, he broke into a wide grin. "Well, in that case, count me in. Lord knows these old bones could use some new tricks." As the two men shook hands, Ethan felt a weight he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying start to lift. Winning over former colleagues like Jack was just as important as upgrading the school's facilities. The weeks flew by, and soon it was time for the new school year to begin. The night before the first day of classes, Ethan found himself unable to sleep. He wandered the halls of Jefferson High, marveling at the transformation. Smart boards had replaced chalkboards, ergonomic furniture filled the classrooms, and a sense of possibility seemed to permeate the air. As dawn broke, Ethan stood at the front entrance, watching as buses began to arrive and students poured into the school. The mix of excitement and nervousness on their faces brought a lump to his throat. This was it, the moment of truth. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of adjustment and discovery. Students marveled at their new surroundings and the cutting-edge technology at their fingertips. Teachers, some enthusiastic and others more hesitant, began to incorporate new teaching methods and digital tools into their lessons. Not everything went smoothly, of course. There were technical glitches to iron out, skeptical parents to reassure, and the inevitable resistance to change from some quarters. But with each passing day, Ethan could see his vision taking shape. One afternoon, about a month into the school year, Ethan was observing a science class when he noticed a student in the back row struggling with her tablet. As he approached to help, he recognized her as Lily Jennings, Harold Jennings' granddaughter. "Having some trouble?" Ethan asked gently, kneeling beside her desk. Lily nodded, frustration evident on her face. "I just don't get it, Dr. Foster. All this fancy tech stuff, I'm no good at it. Maybe Grandpa was right. Maybe this isn't for people like us." Ethan felt a pang in his heart. This was exactly the kind of self-doubt he'd fought against his entire teaching career. "Lily," he said, his voice kind but firm, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. There is no such thing as people like us or people not like us when it comes to learning. Every single person in this room, in this school, has the potential to do amazing things, including you." He spent the next few minutes walking Lily through the basics of the tablet, showing her shortcuts and tricks to make it easier to use. By the end of the class, she was beaming with pride at having completed the assignment. As Lily packed up her things, Ethan overheard her talking excitedly to a classmate. "Did you see? I did it. Wait till I tell Grandpa. He's not going to believe it." Ethan couldn't help but smile. Change was happening one student at a time, but not everyone was as easily won over. As word of Jefferson High's transformation spread, it began to attract attention from beyond the town's borders. Education experts, politicians, and media outlets all wanted to see firsthand what was happening in this small Midwest school. With the increased attention came increased scrutiny. Some praised the program as a model for the future of education, while others criticized it as an expensive experiment that prioritized technology over traditional learning. The controversy came to a head when a national news program announced they would be doing a feature story on Jefferson High. As cameras rolled through the halls and interviewed students and teachers, Ethan found himself thrust into the spotlight once again. The night the segment aired, it seemed the entire town was watching. Ethan sat in his living room, his heart pounding as he saw his face appear on the screen. The report was mostly positive, highlighting the innovative programs and the enthusiasm of the students. But then came the moment he'd been dreading. "But not everyone is convinced," the reporter's voice intoned. "Some question whether Dr. Foster's high-tech approach is really in the best interest of the students, or if it's simply a way for him to rebuild his tarnished reputation." The camera cut to an interview with a stern-faced woman Ethan recognized as a member of the State Board of Education. "While the program at Jefferson High is certainly impressive," she said, her tone skeptical, "we have to ask ourselves, is this sustainable? And more importantly, can we trust someone with Dr. Foster's complicated history to be in charge of such a radical overhaul of our education system?" As the segment ended, Ethan's phone began to ring. It was Principal Thompson. "Ethan," she said, her voice tight with concern, "we need to talk. The school board wants an emergency meeting tomorrow morning." Ethan hung up the phone, his mind racing. He had known this day might come, had prepared for it. But now that it was here, he felt a familiar fear creeping in. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built was once again at risk. But as he looked around his living room, his eyes fell on the Teacher of the Year plaque he'd rescued from his classroom all those years ago. Next to it sat a stack of letters from current Jefferson High students, thanking him for believing in them, for giving them opportunities they never thought possible. Ethan's fear gave way to determination. He had faced adversity before and come out stronger. This time would be no different. Tomorrow, he would stand before the school board not as a man seeking redemption, but as an educator fighting for the future of his students. As he began to prepare his defense, Ethan realized that this moment of challenge, of standing up for what he believed in despite the odds, was the true revenge he had been seeking all along. Not against any one person or institution, but against the injustice and small-mindedness that had derailed his career 3 decades ago. Tomorrow would be a new day, a new battle, and Ethan Foster was ready for it. The morning of the emergency school board meeting dawned gray and overcast, mirroring the tension that hung over Jefferson High. As Ethan made his way through the school's parking lot, he was met with a sea of familiar faces. Teachers, students, and community members, all gathered to show their support or voice their concerns. Inside the school's auditorium, the atmosphere was electric. The board members sat at a long table on the stage, their expressions a mix of concern and curiosity. Principal Thompson caught Ethan's eye as he entered, giving him a small nod of encouragement. As the meeting was called to order, Board President Margaret Whitaker, a stern woman in her 60s, addressed the crowd. We've called this emergency session to address the concerns raised by recent media coverage of the changes at Jefferson High. Dr. Foster, if you'd like to make an opening statement. Ethan took a deep breath as he approached the podium. He looked out over the sea of faces, some friendly, some hostile, many uncertain, and began to speak. Members of the board, fellow educators, students, and members of our community, he started, his voice steady and clear. I stand before you today not to defend my past, but to fight for our future. The program we've implemented at Jefferson High isn't about me or my reputation. It's about providing our students with the best possible education to prepare them for a rapidly changing world. He went on to detail the improvements in student engagement and test scores that had already been observed in the short time since the program's implementation. As he spoke, he could see some of the skeptical expressions in the audience beginning to soften. But don't just take my word for it, Ethan continued. I'd like to invite some of our students and teachers to share their experiences. One by one, students and faculty members stood to speak. Lily Jennings, her voice shaking slightly but growing stronger with each word, described how the new program had helped her discover a passion for computer science she never knew she had. Jack Holloway spoke about how the new teaching methods had reinvigorated his love for education after 30 years in the classroom. As the testimonials continued, Ethan could see the mood in the room shifting. Even some of the more skeptical board members were nodding along, clearly impressed by the passion and enthusiasm on display. But just as it seemed the tide was turning in Ethan's favor, a voice from the back of the auditorium cut through the positive atmosphere. This is all very touching, the voice sneered. But aren't we forgetting something important? Heads turned to see Richard Caldwell, the former principal who had fired Ethan all those years ago, making his way down the aisle. Though older now, his face lined with age, there was still a hardness in his eyes that Ethan remembered all too well. Mr. Caldwell, Board President Whitaker said, surprise evident in her voice. We weren't expecting you. Do you have something to add to these proceedings? Caldwell reached the front of the room, turning to face the crowd. I think we're all getting caught up in the glitz and glamour of these new gadgets and forgetting the real issue here. Can we really trust the man behind all this? A man who was fired for inappropriate conduct with a student. A murmur ran through the crowd. Ethan felt his heart racing, but he forced himself to remain calm. This was the moment he'd been preparing for. Mr. Caldwell, Ethan said, his voice level, I think it's time we addressed those allegations head-on. He turned to the board. With your permission, I'd like to present some new evidence. At the board's nod, Ethan produced a file folder. These are sworn affidavits from former students and colleagues, all attesting to my character and conduct during my time at Jefferson High. But more importantly, I have here the results of a private investigation that uncovered the truth behind those false accusations. As Ethan began to read from the documents, the room fell silent. He detailed how the investigation had uncovered evidence that the accusations had been fabricated by a student who was angry about receiving a failing grade, and how that student had later recanted their story, a recantation that had been buried by the administration at the time. As he spoke, Ethan could see Caldwell's face growing paler. When he finished, all eyes in the room were on the former principal. "Mr. Caldwell," Board President Whitaker said, her voice tight with barely contained anger, "did you have knowledge of this recantation at the time of Dr. Foster's dismissal?" Caldwell sputtered, his composure cracking. That is to say, we thought it best for the school's reputation," but his protests were drowned out by the rising murmur of the crowd, which quickly turned into outright calls for justice. Amidst the chaos, Amanda Chun stood up, her voice cutting through the noise. "I think we're missing the point here," she said firmly. "Yes, a great injustice was done to Dr. Foster, but he's not here for revenge or to rehash the past. He's here to give our children, all of our children, the kind of education that will prepare them for the future. Isn't that what really matters?" Her words seemed to bring the room back into focus. Board President Whitaker nodded, a small smile on her face. "Dr. Chun is right. While we will certainly be looking into the events of the past, our primary concern must be the future of Jefferson High and its students." She turned to Ethan. "Dr. Foster, in light of everything we've heard today, I think I speak for the entire board when I say that we fully support the continuation and expansion of your program." The auditorium erupted in applause. As Ethan looked out over the cheering crowd, he felt a weight he'd been carrying for 30 years finally lift from his shoulders. This was more than just a professional victory, it was personal vindication. But even as he basked in the moment, Ethan knew that the real work was just beginning. Winning over the board was just the first step. Now came the challenge of truly transforming Jefferson High, of proving that his vision for education could make a lasting difference in the lives of students. As the meeting adjourned and people began to file out of the auditorium, Ethan found himself surrounded by well-wishers. But his eyes sought out one person in particular. He found Lily Jennings standing with her grandfather, Harold. "Dr. Foster," Harold said gruffly, extending his hand, "I reckon I owe you an apology, and a thank you, for what you're doing for Lily and all the other kids." Ethan shook his hand, a lump forming in his throat. "No apology necessary, Mr. Jennings. We're all here for the same reason, to give these kids the best future possible." As he watched Lily excitedly telling her grandfather about her latest coding project, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. This moment of connection, of bridging divides and opening minds, was the true revenge he'd been seeking all along. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be more challenges to face, more minds to change. But as Ethan looked around at the transformed Jefferson High, at the excited faces of students and the renewed passion of his fellow educators, he knew that they were on the right path. This was just the beginning of a revolution in education, one that would ripple out far beyond the borders of their small town. And Ethan Foster, once cast out and forgotten, was leading the charge. As the weeks turned into months, Jefferson High became a beacon of educational innovation, attracting attention from across the country. Educators, policymakers, and journalists flocked to the small Midwest town to see firsthand the transformation that was taking place. Ethan found himself busier than ever, not just overseeing the day-to-day operations of the school, but also fielding requests for interviews, giving presentations at educational conferences, and consulting with other school districts interested in implementing similar programs. One crisp autumn morning, as Ethan was preparing for a video conference with a group of educators from California, he received an unexpected visitor. It was Sarah Thompson, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Ethan," she said, closing the door behind her, "we need to talk. The State Board of Education has been in touch. They want to use Jefferson High as a pilot program for a statewide educational reform initiative." Ethan's eyes widened. This was an opportunity beyond anything he had imagined when he first returned to Jefferson High. But Sarah's expression told him there was more to the story. "That's incredible news, Sarah," he said cautiously, "but I'm sensing there's a but coming." Sarah nodded, her expression grave. They want to bring in their own team to oversee the expansion, which means they want me out," Ethan finished, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. Sarah nodded sadly. "They say it's nothing personal, just a matter of having neutral leadership for the program. But after everything that's happened, Ethan, I can't help but wonder if there's more to it." Ethan sank into his chair, his mind racing. He had known that his past would always be a shadow hanging over him, but he had hoped that the success of the program would speak for itself. Now, it seemed he was being pushed aside just as his vision was on the verge of changing education on a much larger scale. For a moment, Ethan felt a familiar anger rising within him. It would be so easy to fight back, to rally the community that had come to support him, to expose the politics and prejudice that still sought to hold him back. But as he looked around his office, at the photos of smiling students and the thank you notes pinned to his bulletin board, Ethan realized something profound. This had never been about him. It had always been about the students, about creating opportunities and opening doors that would have remained closed otherwise. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice steady, "I think we need to consider what's best for the students and the program. If stepping aside means that what we've built here can reach even more schools and change even more lives, then that's what I'll do." Sarah looked at him in surprise. "Ethan, you can't be serious. After everything you've done, everything you've sacrificed." Ethan held up a hand to stop her. "I am serious, Sarah. This program, this vision for education, it's bigger than me now. It always was, really. I was just the catalyst. If stepping back means it can grow and reach more students, then that's the right thing to do." As Sarah left his office, visibly moved by his decision, Ethan turned to look out the window at the bustling school grounds below. Students moved between classes, laughing and chatting, many of them carrying the tablets and laptops that had become an integral part of their education. He thought back to that day 30 years ago, when he had been forced to leave the school in disgrace. He had dreamed of coming back, of proving his worth, of showing everyone what he could have accomplished if given the chance. And now, here he was, having achieved all of that and more. But as he watched a group of students gathered around a smart board in the courtyard, excitedly working on some project together, Ethan realized that his true legacy wasn't in the technology or the accolades or even in clearing his name. It was in the lives he had touched, the minds he had opened, the futures he had helped to shape. That evening, as Ethan prepared to address the school board and announce his decision to step down, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't an ending, he realized. It was a beginning, the start of something much bigger than himself. As he stood at the podium, looking out over the familiar faces of the board members, teachers, and community members who had supported him through this journey, Ethan smiled. This, he realized, was the truest, most satisfying form of revenge he could have ever imagined. Not a revenge of anger or bitterness, but a revenge of success, of positive change, of leaving the world better than he found it. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice strong and clear, "I stand before you today not to announce an ending, but a new beginning." As Ethan spoke, outlining his decision and his hopes for the future of the program, he could see the mixture of shock, admiration, and understanding on the faces before him. And in that moment, he knew that his journey, a journey that had begun in pain and injustice 30 years ago, had finally come full circle. This was his redemption, his vindication, his legacy. And it was so much more powerful, so much more meaningful than any revenge he could have ever dreamed of. In the weeks following Ethan's announcement, Jefferson High buzzed with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The news of the statewide expansion brought pride to the community, but Ethan's impending departure left many feeling uncertain about the future. As Ethan prepared to hand over the reins, he threw himself into ensuring a smooth transition. He spent long hours documenting processes, mentoring teachers, and meeting with the incoming leadership team from the State Board of Education. One afternoon, as Ethan was packing up his office, a soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see Lily Jennings standing in the doorway, her eyes red-rimmed as if she'd been crying. "Dr. Foster?" she said hesitantly. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Ethan smiled warmly, gesturing for her to come in. Of course, Lily. What's on your mind? Lily sat down, fidgeting nervously with the strap of her backpack. I heard you're leaving, she blurted out. Is it true? And is it because of people like my grandpa who didn't believe in you at first? Ethan's heart clenched at the guilt in her voice. He leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. Lily, listen to me. My leaving has nothing to do with your grandfather or anyone else who might have doubted this program at first. In fact, it's quite the opposite. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Do you remember when we first started this program? How exciting it was to have all this new technology and these new ways of learning? Lily nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Well, Ethan continued, now we have a chance to bring that same excitement to students all across the state. But to do that, we need to let the program grow beyond just our school. And sometimes, for things to grow, we need to step back and let others take the lead. Lily's brow furrowed as she processed this. But won't it be different without you here? You're the one who made all this happen. Ethan shook his head, smiling. I may have started it, Lily, but it's students like you who have truly made it successful. Your enthusiasm, your willingness to try new things, your brilliant minds. That's what this program is really about. And that's not going to change just because I'm not here. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small box. In fact, I have something for you. This is one of the first prototypes of the coding kit we developed for the program. I want you to have it. Lily's eyes widened as she took the box, her fingers tracing the logo on its surface. Really? But why me? Because, Lily, Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion, you represent everything I hoped this program would achieve. You've discovered a passion and a talent that might have gone unnoticed in a traditional classroom. And I have a feeling you're going to do amazing things with it. Lily clutched the box to her chest, tears welling in her eyes. Thank you, Dr. Foster. I'm going to miss you. As Lily left the office, Ethan felt a mix of emotions wash over him. Pride in what they had accomplished, sadness at leaving, but most of all, hope for the future. The day of Ethan's departure arrived sooner than anyone expected. The school organized a farewell assembly, and it seemed the entire town had turned out to say goodbye. As Ethan stood on the stage of the auditorium, looking out over the sea of faces, students, teachers, parents, community members, he felt overwhelmed by the journey that had brought him to this moment. Principal Thompson stepped up to the microphone, her voice wavering slightly with emotion. Dr. Ethan Foster came back to Jefferson High to right a wrong from the past. But in doing so, he's given us all a gift that goes far beyond any personal vindication. He's shown us what's possible when we believe in our students, when we embrace change, and when we dare to dream big. As applause filled the auditorium, Ethan took the podium. He looked out over the crowd, his gaze lingering on familiar faces. Amanda Chen, now a staunch supporter of the program. Jack Holloway, reinvigorated in his teaching. Harold Jennings, who had become one of the program's most vocal advocates. And Lily, clutching her coding kit and beaming up at him. 30 years ago, Ethan began, his voice steady despite the emotion welling up inside him. I left this school feeling broken and defeated. I thought my life's work had been destroyed, my passion for education snuffed out. But today, as I leave again, I do so with a heart full of hope and gratitude. He paused, taking in the rapt attention of the audience. What we've built here at Jefferson High isn't just about new technology or innovative teaching methods. It's about believing in the potential of every student. It's about creating an environment where curiosity is encouraged, where failure is seen as a stepping stone to success, and where every child knows that they have the power to shape their own future. Ethan's voice grew stronger as he continued. As I move on to help bring this vision to other schools, I want each of you to know that you are the true heroes of this story. The students who embraced new ways of learning, the teachers who reinvented their methods, the parents and community members who supported us even when the path forward wasn't clear. You are the ones who made this dream a reality. He looked out over the crowd one last time, his eyes misting over. Jefferson High will always be a part of me, and I hope that, in some small way, I will always be a part of Jefferson High. Thank you for this incredible journey, for your trust, and for showing me that the greatest revenge against injustice is not anger or bitterness, but success and positive change. As Ethan stepped back from the podium, the auditorium erupted in a standing ovation. Cheers and applause washed over him like a wave, and for a moment, he was transported back to that day 30 years ago when he'd last walked out of Jefferson High. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Where once there had been shame and defeat, now there was triumph and hope. As the assembly dispersed and Ethan made his way through the crowds of well-wishers, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Amanda Chun standing there, a knowing smile on her face. "You did it, Dr. Foster," she said softly. "You came back and changed everything. But more than that, you showed us all what it really means to turn adversity into opportunity." Ethan smiled, clasping her hand warmly. "Thank you, Amanda. But remember, this is just the beginning. The real work, the work of continuing to push boundaries, to believe in every student, to never stop learning and growing, that work is in your hands now. All of you." As Ethan walked out of Jefferson High for the last time, he paused at the entrance, looking back at the building that had played such a pivotal role in his life. The pain of the past had been transformed into a force for positive change, touching lives in ways he could never have imagined. This, Ethan realized, was the true meaning of redemption. Not erasing the past, but using it as a foundation to build a better future. As he stepped out into the bright sunlight, ready to take on new challenges and spread the lessons of Jefferson High far and wide, Ethan Foster knew that his journey of revenge, a revenge of success, of positive change, of leaving the world better than he found it, was complete. And yet, in many ways, it was only just beginning. Thank you for listening until the end. Share your opinion about the story in the comments and let us know which character you liked the most. If this story touched you and you want to hear more, click on the next story appearing on your screen. Leave a like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a great community of people who share emotional stories together. Until the next story.